Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are sinking our teeth into one of the most enduring, fascinating, and, well, terrifying figures in human mythology.
Oh, he's great.
We're going beyond the velvet capes and the brooding romance to explore the exhaustive, gritty origin and evolution of the vampire. When you hear the word, you likely picture the sophisticated, maybe even tragic anti-hero, the cinematic Count Dracula, perhaps sipping champagne in a modern-day skyscraper.
And that polished, elegant predator is really the endpoint, isn't it? It's the most recent iteration of this myth.
Right.
What we're seeking to understand today is the cultural concept that came first. It's ancient, incredibly complex, and it keeps evolving because, well, it acts as a living record of human anxieties.
A record of anxieties. I like that.
Yeah. This deep dive is about stripping away all that refinement to reveal the raw creature that first embodied our deepest, most visceral fears. You know, fear of death, fear of contagious disease, fear of social corruption, and the fear of the foreign or other.
So our mission is to go back to the source material, to the mud, really, to the plague years, and maybe surprisingly, to the official military reports that inadvertently ended up documenting the supernatural.
Inadvertently is the key word there.
We have assembled sources that span comparative linguistics, 18th century forensic reports, forensic pathology, and literary criticism. This is a chronological journey that really has to integrate all these threads for you to see the complete picture.
Her roadmap, if you like, starts with the original Slavic pestilence, this grotesque revenant known as the Ubir-Upiór.
The Ubir-Upiór.
Then we'll track its eruption onto the continental stage during the Enlightenment period, which turned localized superstition into this furious academic and intellectual debate across Europe.
Wow.
And finally, we'll analyze its ultimate resurrection and refinement into the seductive, aristocratic, gothic anti-hero that, dominates our screens today.
That roadmap sounds comprehensive, absolutely. But here's a critical question. Why is it so necessary for us to integrate disciplines as diverse as, say, 18th century Habsburg military documentation and modern forensic pathology? Why can't we just stick to the folklore?
Well, because a singular focus gives you, the listener, an incomplete and ultimately pretty misleading narrative. It just doesn't work.
How so?
If you only look at the folklore, you miss the actual devastating medical phenomena that gave rise to the belief in the first place. You miss the why. You miss the context of disease.
Okay.
And if you only look at the literature, you miss the historical shockwave, the one propelled by military expansion and official reporting that granted this creature continental notoriety. It didn't just appear in books out of nowhere.
Right. It had a history before Polidori.
Exactly. We have to integrate all these fields. The linguistic analysis that traces the name, the official reports that documented the supposed vampiric acts, and the forensic science that ultimately provided the rational antidote to truly map how the monster evolved and, maybe most importantly, why it mattered so intensely to people across, well, half a millennium.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this starting at the absolute beginning then, the language. The word vampire has this very European Gothic ring to it. But the sources make it clear it didn't originate in a castle in Transylvania, did it? It started much further east.
That's absolutely right. The modern word is a relatively late adoption in Western Europe. It arrived primarily through German translations of those official reports we just mentioned.
Oh, reports, yes.
Yes, they're crucial. But the root stems directly from Slavic and Turkic linguistic traditions. The term's origin is rooted in the ancient form Ubir-Upiór.
Ubir-Upiór.
In those older myths, Upior roughly translates to vampire or witch, but it carries this weight of deep pre-Christian spiritual fear. It's heavy.
And crucially, the geographical origin of that root word challenges the common perception, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That this is exclusively a Balkan myth.
Absolutely. The etymological birthplace of the Ubir or Upior is actually located much further east than the Balkans. It seems centered around the Volga, or Itil, as it was known, river and the Pontic steppes.
So Central Eurasia, really.
Exactly. This points strongly to a deep root in Central Eurasian, not exclusively Balkan, tradition. The evidence suggests that the widespread nature of the myth is largely attributed to the migratory movements of the Kipchak-Kuman people. They carried their spiritual traditions across the Eurasian steppes as they moved.
So this wasn't just an isolated belief. The sheer mobility of people spread the horror, made it portable.
Highly portable, yes, and integrated into existing pre-Christian spiritual traditions along the way.
And the word itself, Upior, it gives us clues about the creature's violent nature, doesn't it? The linguistics are quite revealing.
They really are. Linguistic clues show a consistent pattern of aggression and violation. We see variations like the Bulgarian form, Ubir, and many respected linguistic theories link the term to Slavic verbs like frepiosa or bipiriusa.
What do you mean?
They mean things like to thrust into or to thrust violently. So, regardless of the precise route you trace it back to, the association is consistently one of violent intrusion, of biting. The Upir is linguistically defined as someone who thrusts or bites. It's inherently aggressive.
That's a powerful and, frankly, pretty aggressive definition. Now let's dive into the core characteristics of this original monster, the Upior. What was it actually like before it acquired its air of sophistication, before the capes and castles?
Well, the Upir is central to nearly all Slavic subgroups, and it was the absolute antithesis of the elegant killer we think of now.
So pretty grim.
Oh, fundamentally grim. It was defined as a decomposing physical body that was possessed by an unclean spirit. It needed blood, or, maybe more generically, the life force of the living simply to maintain the corrupt existence of its own corpse.
Just to keep from falling apart entirely.
Pretty much. And it was universally regarded as deeply vengeful, envious, and malevolent. This was not a creature of romance or tragic destiny. It was pure, localized, terrifying evil, rooted in the grave.
And this is a crucial distinction when comparing it to later myths, isn't it? The sources define the Upior as more than just a blood drinker. It was seen as a generalized agent of chaos.
That is the absolute key to understanding its original function in those societies. The Ubir-Upiór was a kind of holistic explanation for all unpredictable collective suffering.
All of it.
Pretty much anything that went catastrophically wrong. It was blamed for massive communal misfortunes that far exceeded individual feeding. Accounts detail it feeding on both people and domesticated animals, yes, but it was also simultaneously blamed for widespread catastrophes.
Like what?
Natural disasters, sudden crop failures, famine, large-scale epidemics, plagues. When everything seemed to go wrong at once in a village, the Ubir-Upiór was the default explanation. It was the scapegoat for the inexplicable.
So it sounds less like a specific monster in some ways, and more like a kind of theological or spiritual explanation for the existential chaos of village life, especially in pre-Christian or early Christian contexts, where something like crop failure could literally mean total annihilation for the community.
Exactly that. It personified that uncontrollable chaos.
Wow.
And the social disruption caused by this belief in the Ubir-Upiór became so intense, so real, that it actually required state intervention centuries before the Enlightenment even got going.
State intervention, really?
Yes, the sources cite that in 14th century Serbia, authorities had to formally ban vampire burials. This wasn't just idle folklore. This was serious social panic demanding legal control from the top down.
Okay, what exactly were these vampire burials they were trying to stop? What did that entail?
Well, they were rituals, often involving quite extreme acts of corpse desecration or mutilation. Things like driving stakes through the body, decapitation, sometimes burning the corpse entirely. It was all done out of sheer terror to prevent the suspected revenant, the Ubir-Upiór, from returning to the community and causing more harm. The fact that the state had to step in and actually ban these practices highlights the magnitude of the belief and the institutional fear it instilled in the general populace. It was destabilizing.
It really shows how real this threat felt.
Yeah.
So how did one become this nightmarish revenant according to the folklore? Were there specific rules or triggers?
Oh, yes. The folklore was very prescriptive about that. There were generally 4 main pathways defined in traditional Slavic beliefs, often acting as a kind of karmic or spiritual penalty.
Okay, what were they?
First, if the person was considered inherently evil during life, maybe a dark sorcerer known as a Hortdan.
A Kolden.
Second, if they died an unnatural, violent, or sudden death, anything outside the expected peaceful order of passing, suicide was a big one.
Right, disrupting the natural order.
Third, if they were cursed, perhaps by a relative or another sorcerer while still alive, a powerful curse could doom you.
And the fourth, this one sounds familiar.
And fourth, the one that really anticipates later, more literary tropes, if they were bitten or somehow infected or touched by an existing Ubir-Upiór. Contagion.
Ah, the contagion element was there early on. And visually, what did this creature look like? It must have been absolutely ghastly, confirming its low earthen status, right?
Ghastly and horrifying, absolutely. Yet importantly, retaining a recognizable link to the deceased person, they were often marked by an extremely pale or sometimes mottled complexion, maybe red eyes, long claws like animals, and often fangs or sharp teeth.
Fangs were there from the start.
Often, yes. But crucially, unlike their later aristocratic counterparts who sort of shunned the earth and decay, the Upior was fundamentally a creature of the soil and decay. Sometimes it was even described with physical deformities present from birth or death, like having been born with a caul, that's the remaining fetal membrane, or even having a tail. These marked them as inherently monstrous.
So truly a horror rooted in the physical decaying body, in the grave itself.
Exactly. Nothing glamorous about it at all. Pure physical corruption and menace.
So we have this localized horror. The soil-stained, decomposing, chaotic Upior. This is the reality, let's say, around the 14th century, persisting locally. Now, how did this regional superstition explode onto the continental stage? How did it become the object of furious intellectual debate across Europe? That seems like a huge leap.
It was a huge leap, and it happened relatively quickly in the 1720s and 1730s. This period is retrospectively known as the vampire epidemic.
A vampire epidemic. Sounds dramatic.
It was, and the mechanism behind it was largely geopolitical expansion. The powerful Habsburg monarchy based in Austria was aggressively expanding its military and political control. They were moving into newly acquired Balkan territories, places like Serbia following successful wars against the Ottoman Empire.
So soldiers and administrators moving into new areas.
Precisely. As these Western administrators, officials, doctors, and soldiers entered these regions, they encountered these deeply established, active local traditions regarding the upper or revenant. Beliefs that were just part of the local reality.
And here's where the translation of fear becomes critical, as you mentioned earlier. What happened when this Serbian folk panic met the rigid structure of formalized, German military reporting?
That meeting is where everything changes. It essentially granted regional superstition the undeniable authority of empirical observation, at least in the eyes of the wider European audience.
How would that work?
The Habsburg administration, being very keen on rationalizing and documenting their new territories, required official reports. So local panic got translated into formalized military and administrative documents, written by educated officers, doctors, and provosts.
In German, presumably.
Mostly in German, yes. And when these reports, which sounded very official, very factual, were published in newspapers and journals across Central Europe, they turned what was a regional anomaly into a continental news story. Suddenly, it became a subject of intense academic debate, giving the vampire its first real taste of intellectual legitimacy, or at least notoriety.
Fascinating. And the sources point to two specific case files that apparently changed everything, cementing the creature's existence in the Western imagination. Starting with Peter Blagojevich in 1725.
Yes, Peter Blagojevich, or Peter Blagojevich from the Serbian village of Kisiljevo. This is the critical juncture. His case is famous, really famous, because it contains the earliest documented use of the actual word vampire in a formalized German report. That's significant.
The first official use of the word vampire. What happened in his case?
Well, Blagojevich died, but his death was quickly followed by a cluster of 9 sudden deaths in the village, all within just 8 days. Very alarming. The victims apparently claimed on their deathbeds that Blagojevich had appeared to them in their sleep and had strangled or suffocated them.
Strangled them. And the exhumation, that's what really turned this into an international story, right?
Absolutely. The exhumation report by Provost Froman, the imperial official on the scene, was the key. He documented the exhumation of Blagojevich's body several weeks after death, I think around 10 weeks. He noted, quite officially, that the body was completely fresh, showing none of the signs of putrefaction that should have occurred after that much time in the grave.
No decomposition.
Little to none, according to him, and this is the vital moment. He noted with wonder, as he put it, the presence of fresh blood in the corpse's mouth.
Fresh blood.
Which the observers, including Froman himself, instantly interpreted as undeniable proof that the corpse had recently fed upon the deceased villagers. This official empirical-sounding report was then published in a major Vienna newspaper, Das Wienerische Diarium, and it just launched the controversy across Europe. People were hooked.
Wow. So Blagojevich introduced the official term vampire and the idea of official corroboration through exhumation. Then we get Arnold Powell, whose case in Midwiga became, the sensational peak of this epidemic.
Kale's case, or Arnold Pell, as he was often called in the German reports, really became the touchstone. His story was even more dramatic. Pale was apparently a soldier, an ex-soldier, who claimed that he himself had been attacked by a vampire previously, somewhere in Ottoman-held territory like Kosovo.
He claimed he survived a vampire attack.
Yes, and in an attempt to cure himself, he had followed local folklore. He'd eaten earth from the alleged vampire's grave and rubbed himself with its blood. Or so the story went.
Okay.
Strange cure.
Very. Anyway, Pale eventually died accidentally, falling from a hay wagon. But then, about 20 to 30 days after his death, a new sequence of sudden deaths began in his village, Midwegia.
Deja vu. So they exhumed him too.
They did. And again, upon exhumation, his body was reported as being undecomposed, looking fresh, with liquid blood visible on his lips, nose, and ears. Very similar signs to Plagojevic's.
And the account of the staking in the Pale case, that's one of the most dramatic, yet, as we'll discuss, medically crucial historical anecdotes in the entire mythos, isn't it? It seemed to convince the officials right there on the spot.
It absolutely sealed the deal for the officials and the terrified villagers alike. The report stated that when a stake was driven through Pale's heart, the corpse reacted violently.
It reportedly groaned aloud, some said it shrieked, and it profusely bled from the wound. That incredibly violent, visceral reaction instantly convinced everyone present of his undeniable vampiric status. There was no doubt left in their minds.
So what did they do?
His body was immediately decapitated and burned, along with those of his alleged victims. These highly detailed, formalized reports about both Pale and Plagojevich were translated, disseminated widely, and spurred intense scientific and theological study across the continent. Everyone wanted a rational explanation for these seemingly irrational, officially documented events.
It is compelling history, you have to admit.
Oh, right.
And what's deeply resonant, kind of chilling actually, is that this wasn't just some distant Balkan issue. The sources point to a direct parallel panic happening in the American colonies, centuries later even, driven by the exact same fundamental fear of the dead returning.
Yes, the New England vampire panic. It's a fascinating parallel. This spanned a huge swath of time, really from the late 18th century all the way up to the late 19th century in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, rural areas mostly.
And what drove it there? No Habsburg reports, presumably.
No, what drove it was disease. This period coincided directly with the devastating endemic spread of tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was commonly called.
Consumption. Apt name.
Terribly apt. Families watched their loved ones waste away, seemingly consumed from within, one by one, in sequence. This led to the inescapable, terrifying folk conclusion that the first family member to die was somehow returning from the grave to consume the life force of the survivors.
That pattern of sequential familial death. It perfectly mirrored the invisible, contagious, and deadly nature of TB, didn't it? Before germ theory, what else could they think?
Precisely. They needed an explanation for why death seemed to stalk certain families. The desperation led to at least 80 documented consumption rituals, which usually involve nocturnal exhumations carried out by frightened families and sometimes whole communities.
80 documented cases.
Yeah.
That's significant. And the most famous case, the Mercy Brown incident in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. That stands as the tragic epitome of this whole folk hypothesis, right? Driven by that lack of germ theory.
It really does. It's perhaps the best documented and latest example. Mercy Brown died in January 1892. Her mother and sister had already succumbed to what was almost certainly TB, and her brother, Edwin, was rapidly failing, showing all the classic signs.
The family was being wiped out.
Yes. The community, gripped by panic and urged on by neighbors, decided they had to act. They exhumed the bodies of the mother, the sister, and Mercy.
What did they find?
The mother and sister were, as expected, badly decomposed, but Mercy's body exhumed about 2 months after her burial, crucially during the freezing New England winter, which would slow decomposition.
The cold.
Yes, that's important. Her body was found to be minimally decomposed, looking somewhat preserved. And the key finding, just like in the European reports, her heart and liver apparently still contained liquid, or at least clotted, blood.
This sounds almost identical to the Plagojevich report. The undecomposed body, the liquid blood proof of feeding in their eyes.
It was absolute proof to them. They concluded Mercy must be the cause of her brother Edwin's wasting illness. She was the vampire draining his life.
So what did they do? It sounds horrific.
It was. In a desperate attempt to save Edwin, the town physician actually agreed to oversee the ritual. Mercy's heart and liver were removed from her body, burned on a nearby rock, the ashes were mixed with water, and the resulting, slurry was fed to her dying brother as a cure.
They fed him his sister's ashes.
Yes, it's shocking, deeply visceral, but it shows how powerful this belief was as a tool, a desperate measure for coping with inexplicable, contagious death before they understood microbes. Edwin, by the way, died shortly after anyway.
Of course, what a tragic story. But it brings us right to the core of this deep dive. If people across continents, separated by centuries, were being exhumed and found to be fresh or groaning or bleeding, what was actually happening? How does forensic pathology step in centuries later to demystify these consistent, terrifying observations?
Right, this is where science provides the counter-narrative. The forensic deconstruction is absolutely essential. The entire 18th century European panic and the later New England panic rested entirely on a specific, repeatable catalog of physical signs cited as undeniable proof of vampirism.
Let's listen again.
Okay. Bloating, or a plump appearance, a ruddy or purplish skin coloration, blood or dark fluid purging from the mouth and nose, an apparently undecomposed state relative to expectations, and those dramatic sounds, the groaning or shrieking upon staking or moving the body.
And the argument, championed by scholars like Paul Barber in his work, is that the folklore isn't just superstition, it's actually an elaborate, culturally misinterpreted documentation of perfectly natural postmortem changes.
That is the beautiful, terrifying irony of it all. The alleged signs of supernatural vitality were actually meticulous observations of advanced decomposition processes.
Okay, break it down for us. Let's take the bloating and the ruddy color first. How does science explain that?
After death, the process of putrefaction begins fairly rapidly, especially if the body isn't refrigerated or embalmed. It's driven by the massive amounts of bacteria we all carry, particularly in our gut. These bacteria go to work and produce huge volumes of internal gases, mainly methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide.
Okay, gases build up. So the bloated, plump appearance of the revenant that people reported.
That is simply the gas distension. The buildup of pressure inside the body cavity can be immense, causing the corpse's abdomen and even face to become visibly swollen, plump, distended.
And the color, the ruddy look.
That internal pressure also forces blood, or rather hemoglobin that started to break down, into the superficial capillaries of the skin. This causes the skin to take on a flushed, reddish, purplish, or sometimes mottled dark appearance. It's a condition called postmortem liver or marbling.
So observers saw this ruddy flush and the plumpness and immediately thought,
This person looks healthy. They must have fed recently. They interpreted the signs of decay as signs of vitality.
okay, the plump appearance wasn't proof of feeding, but proof of internal methane buildup. So what about the fresh blood observed in Plagojewicz's mouth? The fluid that convinced the provost this was a vampire.
Right, that crucial detail. That is almost certainly what forensic pathologists call purge fluid.
Purge fluid.
Yes. Because the gas pressure inside the chest and abdomen becomes so extreme, it literally forces internal fluids out of the body's natural orifices, typically the nose and mouth. This purge fluid is usually dark, thick, and contains partially decomposed blood mixed with other liquefied tissues from the lungs and stomach.
So it looks like blood.
It looks like dark, maybe even fresh-looking blood to the untrained eye. So, to an observer lacking any knowledge of microbiology or decomposition science, seeing this dark fluid issuing from the mouth of a corpse could only mean one thing: recent, violent feeding. It confirmed the narrative perfectly.
It fit the story they already believed. Now, the really dramatic part, the shrieks and groans, the sound that absolutely clinched the horror when Arnold Powell was staked. How do you explain that without invoking the supernatural?
Those sounds are simply escaping gases, but you can absolutely see how they would be incredibly convincing evidence for the folkloric mind. It must have been terrifying.
How does it happen mechanically?
When the chest cavity, the thorax, is suddenly and violently penetrated, say, by a stake, or even if the abdomen is just pressed or deflated, the huge volume of pent-up air and decomposition gases inside is rapidly expelled.
Like deflating a balloon.
Exactly. And as that air rushes out, it often passes through the collapsed larynx and vocal cords. The result can be a sound that observers quite reasonably described as a cry, a groan, or even a shriek. It's purely a mechanical possibility, but entirely non-supernatural.
It is truly mesmerizing when you lay it out like that. The precise catalog of folkloric signs of vampirism is, in fact, a culturally misinterpreted but meticulously accurate documentation of natural postmortem changes. The grotesque physical reality of decay became the definitive proof of a supernatural monster.
It's a perfect example of how fear and lack of scientific understanding can shape perception of reality.
And this is exactly where the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, finally stepped in and provided the official antidote. Right. The continuous panic spurred by these official reports eventually reached a breaking point for the authorities.
It did. The Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa, a ruler very much invested in Enlightenment ideals of rationality and order, eventually recognized the significant social and political disruption these panics were causing in her territories. She couldn't have villages tearing up graveyards indefinitely.
So what did she do?
She tasked her personal physician, a highly respected Dutch doctor named Gerard van Swieten, along with other experts, to investigate the entire matter systematically. Go figure out what was really going on.
Van Swieten. And his report concluded. What was the official scientific verdict?
It concluded, quite definitively, that the vampire was a medical impossibility. His report directly attributed all the commonly cited observations, the bloated body, the liquid blood, the apparently fresh appearance, to entirely natural processes of decomposition, or sometimes the lack thereof due to things like soil conditions or delayed decomposition because of cold winter temperatures, as in Mercy Brown's case.
So natural explanations for everything.
Yes. He basically laid out the forensic explanations we just discussed using the best medical understanding of the time.
And the state then took definitive action to enforce this rationalism and put an end to the panic, didn't they?
They did. Based largely on Van Swieten's comprehensive conclusions, Empress Maria Theresa issued a series of definitive decrees in 1755.
What did the decrees say?
They explicitly banned the persecution of supposed revenants. They prohibited the digging up of graves for suspected vampirism and forbade the ritual execution or mutilation of corpses suspected of being vampires. The state basically said, stop this, it's nonsense.
So state-sanctioned enforcement of rationalism.
Exactly. This action officially ended the phase of widespread, state-acknowledged vampire panics in Central Europe. It effectively pushed the monster back out of the realm of official military reports and medical inquiry, and more into the shadowy realm of folklore and, importantly, literature.
The scientists in the state won that round, you could say, forcing the vampire into a kind of temporary retirement from real life. But the idea, the fear, it didn't just vanish, did it? Because the monster, as a concept, was such a potent composite of very real, terrifying diseases that people still couldn't fully explain.
That's exactly why the concept persisted and was ripe for literary adaptation. The vampire achieved this powerful psychological coherence because it was, in effect, a composite monster derived from multiple pathologies that devastated communities but remained largely misunderstood. It's not just one disease, but a perfect storm of maybe 3 separate, woven together medical realities that fed the myth.
Okay, let's break down those pathological correlates. Let's start with the primary driver of that sequential death pattern we saw in New England, tuberculosis.
Right, tuberculosis or consumption. This disease provides the crucial epidemiological pattern and the visual horror of having one's life force drained away.
The wasting away.
Exactly. The disease was known as consumption precisely because it seemed to consume the sufferer from the inside out. Victims displayed extreme pallor, chronic cough, fever, night sweats, and a gradual, relentless wasting, which perfectly fit the folk description of having one's vitality drained by some returning entity.
And the contagion explains the pattern.
Crucially, yes. Because TB was highly contagious, especially through respiratory droplets in close family quarters, it inevitably resulted in that sequential familial death pattern. One family member gets sick and dies, then another, then another. It created this terrifying realization that death was stalking the family. Before germ theory, the simplest hypothesis was that the first one to die was literally supernaturally consuming the rest.
Makes a grim kind of sense. Then there are the porphyrias, a group of rare genetic disorders that seem to provide the iconic aesthetic and vulnerability of the vampire. This is where it gets really interesting, biologically speaking.
The porphyrias, yes. Specifically, certain rare forms like congenital erythropoietic porphyria, or CEP, provide some really striking, almost uncannily perfect symptoms that map directly onto key elements of the vampire myth.
Such as?
Well, the core issue in these diseases is a defect in heme production, leading to the accumulation of toxic compounds called porphyrins in the body. These porphyrins cause extreme photosensitivity.
Sensitivity to light.
Extreme sensitivity. For sufferers, exposure to sunlight can cause severe painful blistering, skin necrosis, scarring, and significant disfigurement over time. This provides a direct, plausible biological basis for the mythological need to avoid daylight. The vampire must hide from the sun to survive, or suffer terribly.
Wow. Okay, that's the sun vulnerability.
Yeah.
And porphyria connects directly to the need for fangs and the famous aversion to garlic as well.
It seems to, yes. In severe acute attacks, or sometimes chronically, the disease can cause significant inflammation and severe recession of the gums. This pulls the gums back, exposing more of the tooth, resulting in the appearance of elongated, pointed, fanged teeth.
Not actual fangs growing, but the appearance of them.
Exactly, due to gum recession. And furthermore, the chemical link to garlic is fascinating. Garlic and related allium vegetables like onions contain high levels of certain sulfur compounds. These specific sulfur compounds are known triggers that can exacerbate the symptoms or even induce acute, painful attacks in some types of porphyria. Therefore, the traditional folkloric aversion to garlic, used as a protective ward against vampires, might have a biological validation for a genuine porphyria sufferer. Garlic would actually cause them extreme pain and suffering.
That's incredible. The folklore accidentally hit on a real biological trigger. So we have the wasting death pattern from TB, the sun vulnerability, and fangs from porphyria. Finally, rabies seems to explain the method of transmission, the bite.
Rabies fits that part of the puzzle quite well. It's an ancient, terrifying, viral zoonotic disease, meaning it jumps from animals to humans. And its primary mode of transmission is through the bite of an infected animal, delivering the virus via saliva into the wound. That's the definitive transmission method for the literary vampire, isn't it? The bite that passes on the curse.
Absolutely. And the symptoms.
Rabies attacks the central nervous system. Victims can display symptoms like hydrophobia, an extreme fear of water or difficulty swallowing, along with agitation, aggression, hypersalivation, foaming at the mouth, and madness. The biting link is strong.
And there's a connection to werewolves, too.
Yes, this link is reinforced by the common conflation of the vampire myth with the werewolf myth in much of Eastern European folklore. Wolves, and sometimes bats, were often identified as carriers of rabies, and the werewolf itself was often seen as related to, or even a type of, vampire. These two myths frequently overlapped geographically and conceptually, both involving animalistic transformation and aggression.
Okay, so if we synthesize all this, the folkloric monster achieved its terrifying power and coherence by being this composite figure. TB provided the pattern of contagious wasting death within families. Rabies provided the method of transmission via biting and the associated aggression. And porphyria provided the iconic aesthetic, the pallor, the fangs, and the crucial vulnerability to sunlight and garlic, a perfect storm of misunderstood medical terror.
It's really the ultimate example of how human minds, faced with deadly, invisible forces they couldn't comprehend, constructed a visible, tangible, composite villain to explain it all. It gave fear a face.
This is the European model we've been discussing, grounded largely in biology and disease. But the sources note that the conceptual need for some kind of life force predator is actually universal. How did other cultures handle this fundamental concept, and what does the difference tell us about why the European vampire eventually became so globally dominant?
That's a great point. The need to explain sudden weakness, illness, or energy loss seems universal. But the form the predator takes is entirely defined by the local cosmology and belief system. We can look, for example, at the East Asian phenomenon, the jiangshi.
The jiangshi, often translated as the hopping vampire or stiff corpse.
Exactly. It's typically depicted as a reanimated corpse, often dressed in official robes from the Qing dynasty, but it's rigid from rigor mortis. This stiffness forces it to travel by hopping with its arms outstretched. Quite a different image.
Very different. But the crucial difference is what it consumes, right? The jiangshi doesn't drink blood, correct?
Correct. Crucially, no, it doesn't feed on biological fluid. The jiangshi sustains itself by sucking qi, spelled Qi, which is the vital life force or spiritual energy from the living.
Qi, the life force.
Yes. This aligns it perfectly with Taoist cosmology and traditional Chinese medicine, where preserving or stealing spiritual essence and vital energy are the critical concerns, not the theft of a physical, biological fluid like blood. The focus is on metaphysical loss, not necessarily physical violation in the same way.
And it's not usually contagious.
Generally not, no. The jiangshi typically doesn't turn its victims into new undead in the way European vampires often do. It's more of a solitary predator of energy.
Okay, and then you have creatures like the Vetala in India, or the aswang in the Philippines, which sound even more distinct.
Very distinct. The Vitala from ancient India is more akin to a ghoul or spirit that animates corpses found in cemeteries. They often hang upside down from trees, which interestingly shares that bat association we sometimes see with European vampires, but their nature is quite different.
And the aswang, that one sounds particularly disturbing.
The aswang from the Philippines is a highly complex, often female, shape-shifting creature that combines elements of a ghoul, a witch, and a vampire, rooted deeply in indigenous animist beliefs. It's often known specifically as a viscera sucker.
A viscera sucker.
Yes. The folklore describes it using a long, thin, tubular, proboscis-like tongue to secretly suck out the internal organs of sleeping victims, or, horrifyingly, the fetuses of pregnant women, leaving just the empty husk. The aswang represents a profound inversion of nurturing, family-focused societal values, feeding quite literally off life at its most vulnerable source.
Chilling. So this brings us back to that core philosophical difference.
Yeah.
Physical blood versus metaphysical kind or internal organs. Why do you think the European focus on blood ultimately proved so successful, becoming the globally dominant archetype?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of history and science, it seems the European focus on physical blood, a tangible, measurable biological fluid, resonated much more easily with the emerging biological and medical sciences of the 18th and especially the 19th century.
It felt more real in a scientific age.
Perhaps. More concrete, anyway. It fit better with ideas about physiology, contagion, and even heredity that were developing. Abstract concepts like ki, or the very specific, visceral, organ-stealing attack of the aswang, while terrifying locally, maybe didn't translate as easily into the increasingly rational, scientific, and globalizing worldview that emerged from Europe. The European monster was already grounded in the physical body and its processes, making it readily adaptable into the rational framework of medicine, pathology, and eventually Gothic literature, which spread globally.
And that literary transition is the third and final massive evolutionary leap we need to cover. The Enlightenment and forensic science effectively killed the vampire as a medical or factual reality, at least for the educated classes. But literature immediately resurrected it, transforming it into a powerful social and sexual metaphor.
It was a remarkably rapid and conscious shift. The creature moved almost directly from being this figure of mud, decay, and rural peasant fear to becoming a figure of urban sophistication, danger, and aristocratic refinement.
Were there early hints before the big ones?
Yes, some early literary hints appeared quite soon after the main panic subsided. There was a German poem by Heinrich August Ossenfelder called The Vampire in 1748, which already introduced some erotic undertones, and the word vampire appeared in English literature, for instance, in Robert Southey's epic poem Thalaba the Destroyer in 1801. But the absolutely pivotal creation, the one that set the mold, was John Polidori's novella The Vampire, published in 1819.
Polidori's The Vampire. This is where we meet Lord Ruthven, the true blueprint for the modern Dracula, and the absolute inversion of that original grotesque Upiór.
Lord Ruthven was a complete radical reimagining. Polidori, who was Lord Byron's physician and part of that famous ghost story challenge that also produced Frankenstein.
Ah, that same creative storm.
Exactly. Polidori created Ruthven as this magnetic, cold, calculating, devastatingly charming, sophisticated, wealthy aristocrat, and deeply amoral. He was a figure who moved effortlessly through high society, through the salons and cosmopolitan assemblies of Europe.
So the opposite of the mud-caked peasant revenant.
Entirely. Polidori deliberately, consciously recast the vampire, not as a foul embodiment of biological decay or peasant superstition, but as a powerful metaphor for social predation, for class exploitation, and for the dangerous, seductive appeal of repressed desire and forbidden knowledge. The monster moved definitively from the graveyard into the drawing room, preying on wealth, status, and innocence rather than just peasant blood.
That's a profound shift. So if the Upiór embodied the fear of the peasant being literally consumed by disease or neighborly malice, then Lord Ruthven embodied the fear of the commoner, or perhaps even the naive upper classes, being consumed metaphorically by the predatory aristocracy.
Precisely. He represents the parasitic elite, using their charm, their money, their ancient lineage, and their social status to drain the life, virtue, and wealth from the innocent or the unsuspecting. Ruthven is the ultimate elite parasite, a much more relevant and perhaps more terrifying fear for the burgeoning, increasingly class-conscious society of the early 19th century.
And subsequent writers took Ruthven's template and solidified the classic visual and narrative tropes we know so well today, didn't they?
Yes, the mid-century writers really hammered down the details. Varney the Vampire, which was published as a massively popular serial, a penny dreadful, starting in 1847, was hugely instrumental in standardizing the myth for a mass audience.
What did Varney introduce?
It gave us that iconic scene of the vampire entering through a bedroom window at night to attack a sleeping maiden that became the definitive trope. It also pioneered the idea of the somewhat sympathetic, internally tormented vampire, the cursed figure. And critically, Varney featured one of the earliest explicit literary depictions of the vampire having long, protruding teeth or fangs used for biting the neck. This sensationalized fiction was cementing the visual rules.
Okay, so Varney added the fangs in the window scene. Then Carmilla, in 1872, solidified the seductive female predator, right?
Absolutely. Shared in Le Fanu's novella, Carmilla gave us the archetype of the seductive, alluring, often ambiguous, and implicitly lesbian female vampire. Carmilla is beautiful, mysterious, and deadly.
And she added more rules.
Carmilla heavily reinforced the use of protruding fangs for the bite, and it also helped establish the convention that the vampire must return regularly to its resting place, though in Carmilla, that resting place was often described as a coffin filled with blood, emphasizing her continual physical need to connect with the source of stolen life. By the late 19th century, thanks to works like these, the vampire was no longer just about death. It was deeply entangled with dangerous desires, forbidden sexuality, and social transgression that threatened the stability of the proper Victorian home.
Which brings us, inevitably, to 1897 and Bram Stoker's ultimate synthesis, Dracula. It feels like Stoker took all those accumulating elements, the social metaphor from Polidori, the torment and visuals from Varney, the seduction and rules from Carmilla, and the dark geography from the original folklore, and fused them into a single immortal figure.
Stoker's genius truly was in synthesis. He brilliantly and successfully fused Polidori's aristocratic elegance and ancient status, Varney's gothic horror elements and hints of internal conflict, Carmilla's subtle, dangerous sexuality and nocturnal predatory nature, and crucially, the foundational geographical darkness and ancient evil associated with the Eastern European revenant tales. He distilled it all down and created the definitive version, the perfect adversary to represent ancient superstition invading rational, modern Victorian England.
Now, we absolutely have to address the most famous and often contested historical footnote associated with Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Is Count Dracula truly modeled on this historical figure? How strong is that connection really?
The Vlad connection. It's probably the most asked question. The connection is certainly there, primarily rooted in Stoker using the name Dracula. This name directly links the fictional count to the historical Vlad III Dracula, the 15th century Prince of Wallachia, who is notorious for his brutality, particularly his use of impalement, which earned him the posthumous nickname Sepe the Impaler.
So the name is the main link.
The name is the explicit link Stoker made. However, the nature of Stoker's inspiration and how much he actually knew about or intended to represent Vlad III is more nuanced than often assumed. The popular idea that Stoker meticulously modeled Count Dracula's character and atrocities directly on the specific, detailed historical accounts of Vlad the Impaler. That idea was largely popularized by scholars much later, in the mid to late 20th century, notably by Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally.
Interesting. So what do Stoker's own research notes tell us about his intent when choosing that specific powerful name?
Stoker's own notes suggest a more symbolic atmospheric choice, driven primarily by dramatic effect rather than historical biography. He consulted a book about Wallachia and Moldavia, and in his notes, he recorded a specific footnote he found there. It explicitly stated that Dracula in Wallachian language means devil.
Devil, not the dragon.
While Dracul meant dragon or order of the dragon, referring to Vlad's father, the footnote Stoker copied emphasized the devil interpretation. The sources strongly indicate he selected the name primarily for this powerful demonic connotation. It immediately gave his count a sense of ancient, untamed cruelty and historical weight. There's very little evidence Stoker was aware of Vlad III's specific nickname, Sepe, or had detailed knowledge of his military campaigns or methods of torture beyond general cruelty. It seems it was more of a powerful, evocative narrative shortcut to ancient, devilish evil, rather than a detailed character study based on the historical Vlad.
That makes sense, choosing the name for its sound and association with evil. Now, what about the other famous historical figure, often linked to vampire lore? Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. She fits that aristocratic, blood-obsessed profile perfectly, especially perhaps for the female vampires Stoker would have encountered in literature like Carmilla.
Countess Elizabeth Bathory serves as probably the most powerful, real-life parallel female archetype to the vampire myth. She was a 16th century aristocratic Hungarian countess, incredibly wealthy and powerful.
And accused of horrific crimes.
Yes, accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young servant girls. The most lurid, though possibly exaggerated, part of her legend is that she reportedly believed that bathing in or possibly drinking their blood would preserve her youth and beauty.
Bathing in blood.
Her alleged crimes, her high elite status, her gender, and her geographical location living in castles in the region that includes parts of modern Hungary and Slovakia, bordering the greater Transylvanian region, make her a very natural parallel archetype to the literary vampire, earning her the nickname the Blood Countess.
But did Stoker use her story?
Again, while she perfectly embodies the themes of aristocratic predation, cruelty, and the connection between blood and vitality or youth, there is no direct evidence that Bram Stoker specifically used Elizabeth Bathory's story as a source when creating Count Dracula. She certainly influenced the broader literary and folkloric tradition of the aristocratic, often female, vampire figure, but a direct link to Dracula itself hasn't been proven from his notes. She remains a fascinating, horrifying parallel, though.
Okay, one final point on Stoker and his creation. His choice of setting, Transylvania. He famously never traveled there, yet it is now absolutely synonymous with the vampire, almost entirely thanks to his novel.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? Stoker deliberately anchored his novel's origin point in the remote, mountainous, mysterious Carpathian Alps, specifically Transylvania. He used travelogues and maps available in the British Museum.
Why that setting?
He chose it to symbolize concealment, superstition, primitivism, and an unconquered ancient past, essentially. Everything that rational, modern, imperial Victorian London was supposed not to be. It was the perfect, exotic, threatening origin for his counting.
But was it historically accurate in terms of local folklore?
This is crucial. Stoker effectively imposed the dominant vampire myth, the vampire type that had caused the 18th century panics further south and west, onto Transylvania for narrative effect. The region itself, while rich in folklore including related supernatural beings like the Strigoi and Moroi, which have some overlapping traits, lacked a strong native vampire tradition in the specific Upiór or South Slavic vampire vein that Stoker drew upon indirectly via earlier accounts.
So he transplanted the core myth there.
Yes, he used secondary sources like Emily Gerard's Transylvanian superstitions to construct the atmospheric setting, brilliantly framing the narrative as one of ancient, primal, Eastern evil invading the modern, rational West. Transylvania became the symbolic heart of darkness in his story.
That brings us full circle then, tracing this incredible evolution. We've gone from a decaying, gas-bloated peasant corpse blamed for famine and plague, all the way to an elegant, brooding, aristocratic metaphor for social and sexual exploitation. Living in a remote castle, Stoker picked off a map.
The complete trajectory is really quite striking when you lay it all out. We start with the raw, folkloric revenant, the physical and decomposing Ubir-Upiór rooted in Slavic fear of death and chaos. That concept then transitioned into becoming a subject of historical documentation, almost accidentally, via those Habsburg military reports on Plagojevitz and Pell.
Then science stepped in.
Then it was subsequently demystified, at least officially, by forensic pathology and the Enlightenment decree of Empress Maria Theresa, only to be immediately resurrected and radically refined as the literary aristocrat, beginning significantly with Polidori's Lord Ruthven and reaching its absolute culmination in Stoker's Dracula.
And the core takeaway, the consistent truth that seems to run through all these centuries and transformations across continents, is that the vampire is ultimately a mirror, isn't it? It consistently evolves to embody whatever contemporary culture fears most intensely at that moment.
Absolutely. That's its enduring power. The creature's focus shifted from primarily biological anxiety, the raw fear of disease, decomposition, death, and rural poverty, to encompassing deep social anxiety. Fear of class exploitation by the aristocracy, fear of political corruption, fear of dangerous, hidden sexuality that threatened the idealized nuclear family structure of the Victorians.
It reflects the anxieties of its age.
Always. The vampire's enduring power, its uncanny ability to keep returning, has always been rooted in how perfectly it embodies the past that refuses to stay buried.
That's a great phrase for it.
Whether that past is a literal dead body in a shallow grave releasing noxious gases that mimic life, or whether it's the enduring specter of ancient aristocratic power and privilege still preying on the modern world, or some deep psychological fear we haven't faced. The vampire represents what won't stay dead.
So, a final provocative thought for you, our listener. If the original monster was the medical terror of the 18th century, embodying disease and decay, and the literary monster became the social and sexual terror of the 19th century, embodying class and repression, then what specific anxieties does this sleek, often hypersexualized, sometimes glittering modern vampire archetype, the one that appears in today's books, films, and TV shows, embody for us now? What specific specter of the past, or perhaps the present, is refusing to stay in the ground today?
That is the essential question, isn't it? As you encounter the myth again in its modern forms, consider what deep cultural nerve it's touching now. Is it the fear of endless, unsustainable consumption, the anxiety about achieving eternal youth or power at the direct expense of others? Or perhaps it reflects a more modern terror, like the fear of invisible, inescapable global infection or contamination. That's what's truly fascinating. The monster keeps evolving because our fears do.